Chapter 381, Possible. Arctic Emperor Bear. Genes detected. Bronze gene, 7, Constitution, F, 7, Intelligence, F, attempt assimilation. Yes, no. It should be possible. There's no reason for it not to. I've done it before. Silas began to use extricate on the Arctic Emperor Bear. His target, obviously, wasn't the gene talent, but rather the genes themselves. Every time he extracted one, he poured it into the gene crystal. In the past, Silas had used extricate on gene crystals to extend their life. It was a smoother process, so he could use the gene crystal more often before it shattered. That was why his 70 capacity gene crystal was still alive and kicking. So why couldn't he do a simpler thing? Instead of fusing the genes together and then extricating the completed gene, why not use the gene crystal as a gene storage device instead? This would add some wear and tear to the gene crystal, certainly. So he couldn't do it with impunity. But that would only be a problem if he was constantly pulling genes out and pushing them in. I guess we'll see how much durability this uses up for sure if this works. Once he had extracted all the genes from the bear, he reached another threshold. Would the system still allow him to try an assimilation now that all the genes were gone? Silas turned his focus inward. He was completely focused on trying to grasp the gene talent that may or may not be there. With a breath, he moved his intention toward yes. It was oddly vacant. The system moved, but there were no genes to grasp onto. Is it gone? Silas sighed inwardly. Extricate was certainly powerful. It allowed him to control runes more complex than he could even begin to study and move them around as he pleased. But it clearly wasn't omnipotent. Just as Silas had this thought, he felt something. It was so impossibly subtle that if not for his comprehension of Rune Soul, he would have missed it. In fact, Rune Soul wasn't solely to thank. After comprehending Rune Soul, extricating bronze genes gave Silas the same level of insight a gold gene would have given him. But he had only experienced that once. Comparatively speaking, he had absorbed 20 of each of the physical genes. They were all common, but they still gave him far more insight than his bronze genes did previously. And because he had experienced each one so many times, Silas' control over his body had reached an unprecedented level. That skill had displayed itself against the Arctic Emperor Bear. The gap in combat skill between himself and the bear was so overwhelming that it hardly touched him. If not for the fact its stats were so far beyond his own, it would have only taken a few exchanges for Silas to kill it. Now, Silas' state of wealth was coming in handy again. That was because the appearance of the gene talent wasn't nearly as obvious as genes themselves. I see, so that's how gene talents work. Gene talents could be tied to specific genes, but they didn't need to be. Instead, they were more of a method of using the genes that already existed in your body. Genes gave you talents that you didn't have. Gene talents used the genes you did have to perform tasks you weren't otherwise familiar with. It was like giving yourself muscle memory you didn't have to train yourself. Unique genes that came with gene talents weren't much different. These kind of unique gene-reliant gene talents just needed to use genes you didn't already have to function. That was the only difference. The Arctic Emperor Bear's gene talent, as such, was spreading all throughout Silas' body. It was trying to form a ubiquitous net that combined several factors of Silas' genes into one ability, and that was why it was so hard to sense. It was practically working on a cellular level, across several organ systems. Without his high understanding of his body, Silas wouldn't have noticed it at all. But now that he had, it's about to fail. My ice poison affinity isn't as high as the Arctic Emperor Bear's, so it's difficult for my body to trigger its success. Silas frowned. It didn't look like there was anything he could do. If his body was too weak, then trying to gain this gene talent or forcefully activating it would only end poorly. Was this a wasted effort? Well, he had at least saved the genes, so it wasn't all bad. Wait. Silas began to work quickly. He took out his transmutation beast skin and expanded it until the entire bear corpse could fit on it. At the same time, he had a portion of his mind focused on the gene talent so that the feeling wouldn't fully disappear. He pulled out his gene crystal and began to extricate the genes one more time, pouring them back into the body of the polar bear emperor. Crack. Silas couldn't help but cringe. His 200 capacity gene crystal had actually shown signs of breaking down already. It seemed that this wasn't a viable long-term solution for storing genes. If this gene crystal broke before he could upgrade Etherflow, he wouldn't even be able to describe his regret. Still, he pressed forward, extricating the last gene. Then, he poured his ether into the transmutation beast skin. WHOOOSH. A strong energy pulsed, and the bear's corpse was compressed and compressed until it formed a beautiful icy pill with blue runes etched across its surface. That took 7 units of ether, although it didn't have a single silver gene. These half-bronze beasts are no joke. Though he had these thoughts, it didn't slow his action. Silas swallowed the pill in one go. Since his body didn't have the support structure the gene talent needed to take root, then he would just have to supplement it in another way. A body-wide massage thrummed through Silas' limbs. A great amount of nutrients filled him to the brim. Silas' gaze flashed. It's working. Gene talent detected. Trade 5 bronze intelligence, F, and 5 bronze wisdom, F, to unlock Winter's Edge. Yes, no. Silas was speechless. All of that to still be 1 gene short. Chapter 382, Too Fast. Silas closed his eyes and exhaled a breath. He had the 5 intelligence genes he needed because of General Aileen. He had only used 1 of the 7 the General had come with. Unfortunately, General Aileen only had 4 wisdom genes, not the 5 he needed. The good news was that he was fairly confident now that he could bypass his gene limit to directly feed his gene talent. But what good was that when he was missing 1 of the genes he needed? I will just have to find a wisdom gene as quickly as possible. A cold light flashed in Silas' eyes. He always received more genes from humans for one reason or another, and he had a feeling that that truth would only continue to be true with these sylphs. So long as he could kill one of them, the odds that they'd have a wisdom gene for him to take advantage of was very high. So long as he could get his hands on one of them, his odds of surviving would increase. Silas stood to his feet, dismissing the curtain of frost around him. When he appeared again, there was, indeed, another team present. Now, there were a total of 31 people. It didn't seem to have been a long time since they appeared, because when they, too, saw that Silas was a human, they likewise reacted with surprise, subsequently followed by hostility. Team leader, step forward. The gruff voice of the elder spoke out and soon 4 had stepped forward. One of them was, obviously, Silas. As for the others, 2 were women and the last was a man. As the team leaders of the various squads, they were likely also the few that Silas had to be the most worried about. Since this was his last chance, he chose to take a gamble, scanning their stats directly with madness fully activated. All 3 frowned at the same time, but their mental defenses were shattered in the next instant. Aeroina Galesong. Level, 9. Vayu Aeravane. Level, 9. Brisa Celestwind. Level, 9. All 3 of the gazes snapped toward Silas at the same time, but Silas himself had already moved his hand toward the bonfire. Even after going all out and using madness boost less than master scouting greater than, I can only get their levels. But, Silas' gaze flashed as he checked a few more unsuspecting members. All of their team members share the same last names as them. Galesong, Aeravane, Celestwind. These are probably separate factions of their race. Even if they are incredibly hostile toward me, something tells me that they're not exactly kumbaya with one another. However, Silas had taken very clear note of the fact they were all level 9. That meant in the opinion of the system, the people of Earth should pass through 2 watersheds, both level 10 and level 20, before they could fight against a sylph that had yet to be through a single one. Silas pulled his hand back. Out from the bonfire came a frigid token with the Roman numeral 3 on it, 3. If not for his ice poison affinity, just touching this coin would have likely killed him. Aeroina, Vayu, and Brisa all restrained their killing intent, and at the same time, they felt a hint of wariness. They could tell that Silas had succeeded in scanning them just now despite their protections. How was that possible? All 3 hid their tokens, not allowing the other parties to see. This can be troublesome. I didn't try to hide mine. Silas made note of this, but only time would tell how much of a mistake that was. At the same time, he made a mental note to observe more before he acted. Right now, he was acting boldly because he was already public enemy number 1. There were certain things that he could take advantage of with his position, but if he was too bold, he would end up suffering a loss. The portal will open in 1 minute. Prepare yourselves. The elder was a man of few words. After he finished saying these few sentences, he no longer spoke. Silas stood and waited, his gaze focused as though he had forgotten about the world around him. It was then that someone crossed into his vision, appearing so close that he was nearly nose to nose with him. It was Vayu, a young man with deathly green eyes that seemed to reflect off of Silas quite well. Compared to Silas, whose tracksuit was quite tattered by now, he was decked out in beautiful white leather armor that accentuated the slender power of his frame. From this, it was hard to tell from a glance whether Vayu was a swordsman, an assassin, or an archer. But considering the bright white he wore, assassin was probably unlikely. He looked Silas up and down, his gaze frighteningly cold. Then, he suddenly unfurled a scroll. Silas had enough experience by now to recognize a template when he saw one. Enslavement Contract, Bronze, Template. Bind the mind of any F-grade, sub-bronze threat below level 30 to your command. Requirements: consent or plus 100% will, 20 units of ether. Uses left, 1/3. You are likely a citizen of a world currently undergoing your summoning. Since you've appeared here, it means you're under the jurisdiction of my Eravane clan. If you show your usefulness now, it will make your future path much easier. Make the smart decision. After saying this, he held out the template as though prepared to activate it with a nod of Silas' head. Your Eravane clan, you sure talk big, Brisa sneered. She was a beautiful woman much like the other sylph women, but she was exceptionally tall, even a head taller than Silas himself. Her figure was still quite slender, but her exposed shoulders still rippled with muscle striations. Vayu looked over and sneered back. This isn't your place too. Silas took the template from Vayu's hand, looking at it curiously before putting it away casually. Vayu had only been distracted for a moment, but it all happened too fast. Chapter 383, More. You. Silas ignored him, looking toward Brisa and Aroina. There's a reason he was the first to approach me. Those were all the words Silas said, and it made the two of them feel a lurch in their hearts. Even Vayu looked at Silas a bit incredulously. However, time had run out. The token in Silas' hand began to vibrate and the others were forced to rush to their teams. With a flicker, a portal appeared before Silas and he took a step inside. The first thing Silas saw was a staircase of ice. It would have been completely transparent if not for the blue runes swimming through it. Frostbane. These were the first words Silas thought of because it was the very name of this dungeon. It was very likely that Frostbane was an extension, a type, or maybe an even evolved version of ice poison. Or maybe that was just the name of the specific ice poison rune at work here. After all, it wasn't lost on Silas that he had given all the ice poison runes he had come across perfunctory names. These runes, though, were very clearly ice poison runes. But 43 foundations. It was far inferior to his slow and freeze ice poison runes. Silas looked around, but there was no one else here. There were exactly 9 steps before him, and each one was more than double his height. It seemed that the only way forward was, well, up. N-O, vel, B, J-N.C, He bent his legs and leapt up. He caught the edge of the ledge, pulling himself up. The first thing he felt was that the temperature had suddenly plummeted, but he couldn't think about that for very long before a growl caught his attention. Ice Wolf Spirit. Level 5. Physical. Mental. Will. Silas frowned. What was he supposed to make of that? I see. It didn't take him long to figure out what the problem was, and this problem was likely also the reason he couldn't even see the grades of the others. Earth's current stat system was based on relativity. When they first entered the trial, they were given stats from 1 to 10, where 10 represented the 99th percentile of physical or mental capabilities. Obviously, Earth's stat system wouldn't translate 1-to-1 with the outside world. Silas' current system wasn't suited to translating, and that meant that he was flying blind. Silas frowned, but he didn't have much time to consider this matter. The Ice Wolf Spirit had already lunged at him. It was a beautiful creature, about 1.7 meters long, not including its crystalline tail. Its fur was somehow both flexible and formed of ice, its marble blue eyes reminding Silas of the Arctic Emperor bear. It's not very fast, but... Silas's enchanted scholar was still activated, so he immediately noticed that there was something particularly deceptive going on here. The wolf was gathering power from the surroundings in a way that he had never seen before. It seemed like it was even about to level. up. Not only that, but there were several more kernels gathering energy in the surroundings as well as though they were trying to form something. At first, Silas thought that it was a skill of the wolf. But the more he observed, the more he realized that this wasn't the case at all. More wolves. When Silas realized this, he suddenly burst into action. He didn't want to meet the wolf head-on without first fully understanding what its stats were. Although he had a few guesses, that wasn't nearly enough. So instead, he brought out the pauldrons and shin guards of General Aileen again. Pulling on his gluttony seed, the power he could exert almost doubled as he smashed the pauldron into the wolf's face. Bang! The wolf's head exploded and it came to a skidding stop. Silas separated part of his visualization to pay attention to it as he rushed toward the location of the other forming wolves. His mind went through several thoughts at once until he just decided on the most violent method. Using Rune Soul, he forcefully took control of the gathering runes and disrupted them. Just like that, the forming wolves stopped forming. It works. Silas repeated the action, blanketing the region in his visualization and stopping every spawn point until he was satisfied. Just when he thought things were over, his head spun back to the original wolf he had killed. It's reforming itself. Silas' figure flashed and he appeared before the reforming wolf. With a push of his intention, the runes were forced to disperse again. Is that it? His luck wasn't normally so good. He could see how this step could have gotten very difficult, very quickly. But he had been able to stop it before things even got to that point. From what he could tell, every kill came with a certain bit of damage to the runes, and depending on how much stronger you were than the wolves, you would have to kill it anywhere between twice to even 4 or 5 times before it would stay dead. At the same time, more wolves would continue to spawn. Silas had counted at least 3 dozen more nodes of rising spirit wolves. It was no wonder this trial required a team of 10. Things worked out in his favor this time, though. These didn't seem to be real beasts, but rather formations of runes. It was an exceptionally high-level application of rune mastery, and though Silas couldn't understand it, he seemed capable enough to disrupt it. But he also realized that this was only because the wolves were set to a weak level. There was no telling if he would be hard-pressed to disperse them with the same ease if he was up against a stronger spirit construct. It didn't seem like there was anything more here, so Silas moved on, walking toward the beginning of the second step before leaping upwards again. As he was moving, so too were the other teams. They worked together seamlessly, and soon their first clash would come. Chapter 384, First. Vayu cursed in his heart as he commanded his team to move faster. This time, Silas had really screwed him over, and the worst part was that Silas shouldn't have even known. How Silas managed to deduce it was beyond Vayu. Silas' token read 3, while Vayu's read IV. This might seem meaningless, but in the coming clash of team, I would pair with 2, and 3 would pair with IV. This essentially meant that the first opponent that Vayu would come across other than these wolf spirits would be Silas himself. This seemed not to be a big deal. After all, this should be a good thing. Silas was just one person. He should be ecstatic that he basically got a free ride to the final round. Unfortunately, Silas had seen through him. This wasn't a simple tournament where there would be 2 elimination rounds to crown a winner. Instead, depending on how things went, there could end up being multiple rounds where each team would do the best to accumulate points. Once this staircase event was through, there would be a clash, and then there would be 4 doors. These 4 doors would likewise be numbered from I to IV. The first to win would receive priority in choosing your next round's opponent. Meaning, if Vayu was matched up against Silas in the first round and cleared an easy victory, then he would be able to pick Silas again in the next round and secure an advantage all the way up. If he killed Silas, it would be even easier, because that would mean that he would have free reign all the way up to the final rounds where the largest and truest rewards would be. However, because Silas exposed him, things would be different. Because a loss didn't necessarily mean elimination, Aeroina and Brisa might choose to collude, allowing one or the other to gain victory so that they could be the ones to challenge Silas first. This wouldn't be ideal for them, but it would even out the playing field. That was because whoever lost would then proceed to collude with Vayu, and then they'd switch over. So on and so forth. But if Vayu got there first, then it would be meaningless. Eventually, by the end of the rounds, they'd have an even distribution of points and they'd be right back to square one. At the start, they had all seen Scylla's number, so this could have been guessed. But it wasn't until Scylla's pointed it out that they put 2 and 2 together. Before, Eroina and Brisa might have been slow on the uptake and chosen to fight it out. By then, Vayu would have already had an insurmountable advantage. But now, he had to go all out in hopes that he still managed to reach the doors first. Only then could he firmly suppress Eroina and Brisa. Due to a few words from Scylla's, the first round, which should have been more leisurely feeling out process, actually ended up being a full sprint to the end. Victory might very well be decided right here and now. A solemn expression couldn't help but mar Vayu's handsome brows. He didn't know how Scylla's had managed to deduce this, but it had put him in a terrible position. What he didn't know was that it was impossible for Scylla's to deduce the intricacies of all these rules without someone explaining it to him. Vayu could only blame himself for having such stupid reasoning. Trying to enslave Scylla's under the pretext that he would one day be their clan's subordinate made no sense. It was possible that Vayu might have seen Scylla's potential and wanted to enslave him, but using such a rare template on a slave you wouldn't even be able to control for at least another few years made no sense whatsoever. The moment Scylla saw the template, he realized that his being enslaved should somehow help Vayu out in the here and now. Vayu had tried to have his cake and eat it too. He wanted to close up all potential loopholes, so he wanted for there to be no chance for Scylla's to reverse the situation. In the end, all Scylla's needed to know was this to expose him. He didn't have to understand the details, he just had to vaguely understand what Vayu wanted and expose him on its merit. Then, Brisa and Eroina, who did know the intricacies of the rules, would be able to figure out the rest for themselves. As he had said, they were competitors as well. He might be public enemy number 1, but he wasn't the only enemy. Now, Scylla's competitors were burning through the stamina and reserves in ways they usually wouldn't. While he was leisurely keeping up pace without expending nearly the same amount of energy. The second step and the third step were practically the same. The level of the wolves didn't change. Instead, the number of them, and the speed with which they spawned and recovered was greater. In addition, the second step spawned 2 wolves from the very beginning, while the third step spawned 3, making it a bit trickier to handle. However, now that Scylla's knew what he was aiming for, he didn't hesitate or pause. In fact, he only got better at dispersing and disrupting the runes. He fused his rune's soul control with his telekinesis, applying the same concepts he had learned during his battle with the snail in order to make his disruption sharper and more violent. His telekinesis seemed to give his rune's soul control more substance, and it was then that Scylla's realized that rune's soul was actually an application of his charisma and probably scaled with the stat as well. When he realized this, his comprehension seemed to deepen and the fourth step was somehow even easier than the first despite the fact it now had level 6 wolves. Scylla's charged. All the way up until he cleared the 9th step. The world swirled around him and he found himself locked in a transparent barrier he wasn't allowed to leave. But there was no one else around him. He had gotten here first. Chapter 385, Point System. Scylla's looked around. I'm being forced to wait. Interesting. He was starting to understand why his words had been so effective against Vayu. It seemed that he had stumbled into some good luck after all. He looked around, hoping that there would be rewards of some sort. Usually, there would be more to gain from a dungeon than just whatever the final rewards were. But unfortunately, though he had finally had some good luck, it wasn't that exaggerated. There was nothing here at all. Well, other than the barrier. The barrier. Scylla's looked at it, activating Enchanted Scholar. These days, it was too easy to use this gene talent. Usually, it would have some strain on his wisdom, but between Rune Soul lowering the requirements, and Unyielding Scholar boosting his wisdom to ridiculous levels, he didn't even feel it much. He had kept it active all through those 9 steps, actively using Rune Soul to disperse his targets, yet he didn't feel any fatigue at all. Another fascinating application of Rune Mastery. Scylla's carefully touched the barrier. It looked ethereal, but it was as hard as aged ice compressed beneath millions of years' worth of snowfall. Clearly, this barrier was relying on ice poison runes, or rather, frostbane runes. But it was so much more powerful than what Scylla's was capable of despite the fact it should have been a weaker rune. After all, Scylla's could control 2 runes with 11 more foundations than what was found here. Then there were those spirit wolves. That was definitely another application of ice poison runes, but Silas couldn't even fathom completing something so intricate. He didn't even understand how you could turn runes into something that felt so real. Logically, it should be possible. After all, runes were the foundation of the world, its fundamental laws. Since life sprung from the world, runes should have the innate ability to grant life. But he couldn't see how one could make the leap from one to the other nonetheless. It was too complicated for even him to wrap his head around. If he had to guess, it was likely the system doing the heavy lifting again. It was more than likely that whoever created those wolves had a class skill that did it for them. Interesting, this sort of rune configuration. If I deploy less than Arctic Halmatant like this, its defense would increase probably by another 50%. Less than Arctic Halmatant already had 1000 defense, another 50% would be no joke at all. I focused too much on making each individual rune powerful, but not enough on making each rune play off against one another well. These runes work like a circuit, and there's a flow of energy between them, and they're designed for better ether control over the whole. If I take the circuit analogy to an extreme, some of the runes are placed in series in order to rapidly increase strength, and some are placed in parallel in order to increase sustainability. The combination of the two finds a balance across the whole skill in order to create something more powerful. Of course, it was more complicated than this, and seemed to also be related to geometry, both in regard to the individual runes and that of the overall skill. For example, triangles were still the strongest shape, but not every rune would allow you to place 3 side by side like that. Plus, the skills would be in 3D, adding another layer of complexity. Just as Silas was about to check if his hypotheses were correct, his gaze flashed as another group appeared. He looked up to find that it was Aeroina. She was one of the 3 that he had never heard speak before. Being far more dainty than the giant Brisa, she didn't have the height of a fashion model, but she definitely had the face of one. Her eyes were striking blue, and when she saw Silas, she couldn't help but be surprised as well. He had actually gotten here first. Flash, flash. Soon afterward, Vayu and Brisa seemed to appear at the exact same time. Everyone's expression changed at once. The fact that Silas was here ruined all of their plans again. That was because the moment all 4 were present. Pop. Their bubbles shattered and the 4 were transported once again. The world was identical to the worlds of the iced steppes. Snow fell from the skies, a chilling land of ice and blue runes was beneath their feet, and a perpetual white fog formed the barriers of the world's edge. Still, the first thing Silas noticed wasn't the fact that Vayu and his team had appeared across from him, but it was rather the fact that there were several spawn points for wolves as well. Why would there need to be spawning wolves if this is a head-to-head battle? There was a possibility that it was just for an added layer of chaos, but Silas didn't feel that this was the most likely choice. There was already supposed to be a 10v10 battle, why would they need more chaos? Point system. Silas looked toward Vayu's team and realized 2 things. First, they were all scanning the area as though they were looking for something, and second, they were tired. There's no reason for them to be so tired with their strength unless they rushed here. Suddenly, it all clicked for Silas at once. He took the initiative, moving first. This must be a point-based victory. The point shouldn't be to kill your opponent, instead it's more like capture the flag where your opponent is a hindrance. The moment Silas realized this was the moment he also realized that he had already all but won. His visualization had a 30-meter range that could cover almost half of this arena. He could easily claim a large number of points while they were still waiting for the wolves to spawn. But he didn't choose to do so. That was because for the sake of his gene talent and to deal with the inevitable next rounds, he needed at least one of them to die. And there was no better time than when they were both tired and distracted. Chapter 386 Lolaline. Vayu's team was so stunned they weren't even sure how to react. They felt that Silas was so insignificant that they didn't even properly set up defenses around him. Their shieldmen were all focused elsewhere, ready for the beasts to start charging at them. None of them were ready for Silas to suddenly burst forward like he did. However, Silas was simply too slow. They were stunned, but all of them had speed that was easily 3 times that of Silas' own, and that included even the weakest of them. They started over 50 meters from one another, and though Silas could clear that distance now in what was less than 3 seconds, that was still far too much time for existences of their caliber to react. Vayu frowned. Sergen, kill him. Don't play with your food, do it swiftly. The rest of you form up. Originally, Vayu didn't want to do this. It would be easier to directly manipulate Silas, but he understood that there was a problem here. For Silas to make it here at all, he had to have something that was special about him. As such, Vayu was smart enough not to send the weakest of the group at Silas. Sergen was his second in command and second in strength only to himself. He was also the second least affected by their stamina drain on the way here. Sergen Eravane. Level 9. Silas scanned the man before him, but still couldn't see any stats. Unfortunately, he didn't have the luxury of trying another method because Sergen was already upon him. Fast. The man was like a blur of icy blue, a pair of daggers that matched appearing before Silas in a blink. Without a choice, Silas activated less than Arctic Howl Mutant greater than. His speed might be greatly inferior to Sergen's, but his wisdom certainly was not. His ability to think and calculate at this pace of battle wasn't just not hindered, but it was superior to any one of the sylphs. Sergen's attack was rebuffed, causing him a great deal of surprise. For Silas to block his attack with a skill, he had to have anticipated it. There was no instant casting at their level. Even classes that claimed to give it still caused small half-second delays. The sylph second in command was immediately several grades more serious after seeing this, but when he went to move, he was shocked to find that he was actually frozen in place. Not good. Sergen reacted swiftly, triggering a counter skill of his own, but Silas didn't even bother to try and analyze it. He had already sidestepped Sergen. In one breath, he accelerated forward and sent a normal less than chilling scyther behind him to delay Sergen further. Embarrassment dug deep into Sergen's bones, churning up his insides. He couldn't read Silas' stats, but his speed and the power of his skills painted enough of a scene. It was likely that Silas had a rare mental comprehension that allowed him to counter their probing, but for him to suffer at its hands like this. Silas didn't give Sergen another glance, pushing his legs as fast as they would go as he crossed the rest of the distance between himself and the group. Before he reached them, Sergen had already broken free, but as expected, he was forced to clash with Silas' less than chilling scythe greater than, delaying him further. Silas' ice-cold green eyes flashed as he scanned the group. By now, there were already wolves pouncing on him, having finally formed, and many more were coming. However, Silas wasn't looking toward the wolves at all. He was trying to find something. He scanned over the entire group until his gaze landed on it. There. The weak lamb of the group. Silas stomped a foot and he activated less than momentum shift and less than sudden burst at the same time. The skill and gene talent stacked, a deft control and understanding of his own body displaying itself as Silas changed direction without losing a single ounce of speed. Bang! Where he had just been standing, a scythe of energy cut into the icy ground, an attack that came from Sergen to be sure. Vayu's expression changed, realizing what Silas was trying to do. But he was already in the middle of attacking. It was like Silas had bided his time, only making his target clear the instant Vayu wasn't in a position to do anything about it. A young female sylph who still had the large, watery eyes of a teenager panicked when she realized her situation as well. She was fighting with a partner against a spirit wolf, and she was usually the support of the group to begin with. Usually, the support would try to hide themselves from being scouted out, but because their opponent was just one person, most, even Vayu, had let the guard down. Until now, she had already cast several support skills. Never did she think that such a thing would happen. She locked eyes with Silas and for a moment, she was absolutely certain that they turned into a golden slit right before her eyes, as though she was no longer even staring at a human. There was a flash and suddenly she felt her mind being locked down by an overwhelming presence. A scroll appeared in Silas' hand and a devastating momentum burst forth. They didn't even have the chance to understand what was going on when the scroll formed a beam of light that rushed into Silas' forehead, only to exit with an even fiercer light that pierced toward the young woman. There was no suspense. Her eyes became dazed and glazed over. A moment afterward, she regained her bearings and suddenly went pale as she likewise understood what happened. Lolaline. The sylph the young girl had been working with cried out in shock and horror, but she had her hands full. The sylph had been forced to take on the brunt of the defense after Lolaline was targeted, and now. One of their own had been enslaved. And more unfortunately for her, Scylla's was still present. Chapter 387 couldn't even see. Scylla's was swift and decisive. Appearing behind Lololine's partner, he unleashed a swift punch. The girl was no pushover, casting an area of effect defensive skill not too different from less than Arctic Howl greater than. This skill came with a pulse of light that pushed everything away, including Lololine. A frostiness coated Scylla's body and seemed to want to eat into his flesh, but he clenched his fists once and shattered it apart. His constitution was inferior to these people, but his control over runes was far superior. Their ice poison couldn't affect him so long as he dealt with it before it penetrated deeply. Unfortunate. This was Scylla's only thought as he failed to kill the girl. He had been hoping to kill two birds with one stone, but now he was about to be surrounded. If he delayed for any longer, he would lose his life here. Go. He moved his intention toward Lololine and she had no choice but to obey. They used the momentum of the female sylph's push defensive skill to escape the encirclement, but they were instantly surrounded by wolves, both figuratively and literally. It was at that moment that Scylla's intention moved once again, his will flourishing as his rune soul pressed down. Bang! Several forming wolves exploded all at once and a large number of accumulated points were suddenly forcefully taken away by Scylla's. At that very moment, Sergen had finally caught up. Everything was happening too fast and there was hardly a moment for rest. But Scylla's felt as though everything was resting in the palm of his hands. Nothing could escape his notice at all. He commanded Lololine, but with his mind this time, forcing her to cast a skill he had seen her use in the past. His body was suddenly filled with strength and after a quick check, he realized that his physical stats had increased by 50%, and that was on top of his 25% increase from Surge of the Die. This pushed all his physical stats to over 260, while his constitution became over 300. Scylla's had already taken a huge ether hit from activating the contract and only had 6 units left. He couldn't allow this to continue. There's no way she would have cast this skill so early on if there's such a huge drawback. Their situation wasn't nearly that desperate. That means there's a way to mitigate this sort of loss. However, he also felt that there was a great drain occurring on his ether as well. It seemed that this support skill didn't just pull power from thin air. He was actually using up an ether unit every few seconds. Scylla's had already taken a huge ether hit from activating the contract and only had 6 units left. He couldn't allow this to continue. There's no way she would have cast this skill so early on if there's such a huge drawback. Their situation wasn't nearly that desperate. That means there's a way to mitigate this sort of loss. Scylla's activated less than Maddened Enlightenment at the same time, its silver mastery soaring to gold mastery. Suddenly, his ether unit usage plummeted from 1 ether unit every few seconds, to every few minutes. Lololine's eyes opened wide when she sensed this. She had never seen anyone mitigate the negative effects to such an extent, but Scylla's didn't have the time to indulge her as Sergen had already appeared, his eyes bloodshot. Lololine was like the little sister of the group. Seeing her enslaved like this, not a single one of them wasn't absolutely infuriated. This was especially so for Sergen who failed to stop him. Pang! Fist and dagger met. Scylla's only managed to stop the latter for a short while before he felt his ether skin being shredded through. Even with the stack of basic etherflow, his ether skin, the scorned wraps, and his own personal constitution, it wasn't enough. His flesh suffered moments later and Scylla's was forced to retract his fist quickly. However, that only allowed the dagger to continue forward, aiming right for his throat. Even in this life and death situation, Scylla's seemed to have an endless well of calmness. Bang! Sergen's head went somewhat hazy as a sudden pauldron smashed against the side of his head. It appeared out of nowhere and somehow gained all its possible momentum despite having started inches from his head. The trajectory of the dagger was thrown off and Sergen felt his ears absolutely ringing. Even with his high constitution, being smashed over the head with an almost 50-pound weight wasn't something he could ignore. Even without his fusion with the Basilisk King, Scylla's telekinesis with madness activated could now display 476 points of physical. Sylphs weren't known for their physical stats to begin with. There was a reason the dungeon didn't even give a physical stat point recommendation. Caught unprepared, if not for his ether skin protection, Sergen's head would have already blown to pieces. Unfortunately, Having lost this initiative, Silas didn't show even the slightest hint of mercy. His head almost carelessly twisted at a slight angle, sliding by the new trajectory of Sergen's dagger as he unleashed a fist right into the man's gut. Silas didn't know if the anatomy of a sylph and a human was the same to begin with, so he didn't aim in any particular locations as he unleashed a barrage of powerful punches. By the time Sergen awoke to the pain, he had already suffered a half-dozen punches, the crunch of his bones and the cracking of his ether skin echoing over the howls of the spirit wolves. Use it, Silas commanded Lolaline coldly again, and she was forced to use a bind skill, not on Sergen, but rather the wolf lunging at them. Unfortunately, Sergen thought the bind skill was coming for him, so he used his counter skill at the same time, only to punch at nothing but air. The stabilizing bracelet on Silas' wrist glowed and he cast less than King's Binden that same instant. It landed just after Sergen's counter skill failed and the man found himself frozen in place once again. Despair suddenly colored Sergen's eyes. Somehow, he knew that though he still breathed, he was already dead. He couldn't even see Silas in those final moments, his gaze helplessly looking at Lolaline, whose large green eyes were brimming with tears. Less than psychedelic punch greater than. Chapter 388, points. There was no beast totem that appeared behind Silas this time. He didn't have enough ether left to use it in the first place, but it was never his intention to do so. Although he had learned how to use his own ether to speed up his own personal healing factor, it took time and, obviously, ether. There might not be any breaks at all in this dungeon, and he was already running low on ether after his first real battle. This was to say that there was no way he could afford to waste his high-powered less than psychedelic punch, not when he would end up with a useless arm and no ether to rely on. So instead, he set up the perfect situation to use the weakened version. This was precisely the version of psychedelic punch that relied on slow and freeze to work. It was just unfortunate that it dispersed a great deal of his power when it acted. But the result of the punch shocked even Silas. His fist was almost agonizingly slow as it moved through the air, at least in the eyes of the elites here. If Silas' usual attack speed was 100, then right now it was 40 at most. Yet, when it landed on Sergen's head, the result was astonishing. Crack. First, Sergen was frozen completely in place. Not figuratively, but literally. A barrier of ice completely encased him and pulsing blue runes rampaged through their surface. Sergen's ether skin was suddenly invaded by a cancerous army of ice blue runes and suddenly shattered to pieces. Sparkling motes of ether light fluttered into the air, and it seemed like something even more devastating was about to happen when Silas suddenly took action. Rune's soul moved and forcefully suppressed the action of the runes. If Sergen's entire body became nothing more than ice shards and bits and pieces, how was he going to take advantage of his genes? Retreat, Silas commanded. A pauldron slammed into the head of the beast still bound by Lolaline's bind skill, and the two swiftly left the bounds of the encirclement. With a touch to his frozen shoulder, Sergen's body had already vanished into the madness key as Silas continued to retreat. By this point, the eyes of the sylphs were practically spitting fire. Without Sergen, this competition was practically lost. Vayu couldn't possibly uphold the burden all on its own. On top of that, they had lost the best support class. Although they had another, it was impossible for just one alone to support them all, and it was even worse because this second support was inferior to Lolaline as well. Silas had taken out two of the key pillars and he seemed to have come out completely unscathed. Dismiss your skill. Lolaline complied and the pressure on Silas' ether vanished. Less than maddened enlightenment continued to churn, swiftly adding to his reserves. It's so much faster now. Usually, I can only be this fast when I enter a real state of meditation, but now I can do so while on the move. Lolaline's eyes couldn't help but flicker, her shock palpable. She had never seen such a powerful ether replenishment skill before. It felt like Silas' very pores were opening up to allow ether in. What she didn't expect was that this was precisely what would start happening moments later. Usually, ether could only be taken in through the mouth and nose. Only those with exceptional skill could take it in through other parts of the body. Usually, it would require a special comprehension or gene talent, sometimes even a species change or class change. However, Silas had grasped the intricacies of his ether pathways after absorbing the bronze intelligence gene. He had a better appreciation for how ether moved throughout his body, so he had no need to only use the default pathways. Although it was definitely still much slower than when he took it in through his mouth and nose, Silas found that he could increase the potency of less than mad and enlightenment by another 20% or so. It was very worth it, although it was a drain on his concentration and wisdom. It should be about now. Vayu's team practically wanted to eat Silas alive, but they didn't get the chance to. Silas had planned out everything too perfectly. Before the battle began, he had quietly snuffed out the spawning wolves in his region, clearing out a lane of retreat. Then, when he had his big burst and destroyed a large number of them, he purposely left several more around Vayu's team. While they were fighting it out with the wolves, he was recovering as though the battle had nothing to do with him at all. What he also couldn't help but notice was that they didn't even realize what he had done. This gave Silas a valuable piece of information. They couldn't sense his rune soul at all, likely because their rune mastery was just nowhere near his own to begin with. This made things even easier on him. They didn't even realize that they were behind on points, so even though they were infuriated, they were still focused on at least securing their victory. Which was why what happened when the last wolf fell made them all pale. 1. Silas Grimblade 237 points. 2. Vayu Eravane 36 points. Vayu's eyes opened wide when he saw the system message. How? He unleashed an infuriated roar, unable to believe his eyes. His only thought was that Silas had cheated, but they were all here. How was that even possible? His head snapped towards Silas' direction, only to see violent blue winds whipping around him as ether poured into his body in a frenzy. However, even in that storm, there were a pair of green orbs hovering within him, staring right back at him. Vayu felt an inexplicable cold chill run down his spine, his body losing control for a moment. Just what was going on here? How could there be someone so fearsome on a summoned world? Chapter 389, More Than He Should. Silas walked out of the trial ground with Lolaline in tow. He wasn't sure if it would work, but it seemed that the system had acknowledged Lolaline's change in affiliation. I wonder, when I enter with the Basilisk King, does it count as 1 or 2? This thought surfaced in his mind as he realized how smoothly Lolaline was taken under his wing. He was half expecting for her to be taken back with her group and then likely either restrained or killed. Either way, he had thought that using her again in the future would be difficult. The only reason he didn't kill her outright was because in his views, it still might be possible to use her again. It was unlikely that they had a method to reverse enslavement, or else their reactions wouldn't have been so fierce. So, their only options would be to kill or restrain. If they did the former, so be it. But if they were foolish enough to do the latter, then Silas might be able to make them pay by using Lolaline as a tool for sabotage the next time they met. Unfortunately, all those thoughts were moot. Still, things have gone smoothly. I didn't need to use the Basilisk King or less than Arctic King's domain greater than. I still have a lot of trump cards left that I can spring on an enemy in the future, and I've weakened their team a great deal. Silas was always looking ahead. He knew that this wouldn't be the end of the dungeon, so he had no choice but to hide as much as he could for now. The rules were still a bit of an enigma to him, so caution was the name of the game for now. That would certainly be easier with Lolaline by his side buffing him. Tell me all of your skills, gene talents and abilities, including what treasures you hold. When the duo walked out of the portal, they found themselves before a very familiar set of 4 doors. Realizing that the numerals matched the token they received earlier, Silas came to understand something. So that's why. When Lolaline finished telling him about all her stats, he then asked her to explain all the rules of this place. What a convoluted game. The dungeon was, as expected, more of a coming-of-age ceremony for the sylphs. It was also a way for them to challenge one another without going into all-out war, thus why they were separated into family factions. Unfortunately for them, Silas' appearance had thrown a wrench into the plans. Or so it seemed on the surface. From what he got from Lolaline's words, it was actually a good thing for them that Silas had appeared this time, because it meant that their 4th faction of the sylphs wouldn't be able to take the usual first-place prize. The ceremony was divided into 2 main parts. The first were the stair challenges and the second were the team challenges. The latter were thrown in purely so that these factions could vent their hatred for one another and display whose younger generation was the stronger of them all. It could be said that the stair challenges were far more important. Until now, things were still fairly straightforward and there wasn't much to be confused about. Until the variability of choice was allowed. Between each round, one could choose your opponents. This was meant to be a combination of strategy, foreplanning, and a little luck. Usually, most would do whatever they could to avoid this fourth faction, or make guesses about how certain teams would perform during certain stair challenges to time when it was best to target them or avoid them. This explained a great deal to Silas. Clearly, all of these people had been so eager because they all wanted to target him, only to end up dropping a rock on their own feet. This added layer was where the truly tricky problem came into play. That was because since there was so much swapping of opponents and variability in challenges, the ceremony was judged based off a weighted point system that fluctuated depending on several factors. For example, if you targeted a group that was weak on purpose, the number of points you accumulated would actually be less. However, it was more than possible to offset this penalty if the team was too weak, which would still make such an option worthwhile, thus why Silas was prime meat in their eyes. By the same token, though, there were a great number of extra points to be gained by facing off against teams stronger than yourself. In later rounds, if there was a big gap to be surmounted, some might choose to do this on purpose and go all out. But now, it seemed like it was Silas' turn to take advantage of such a thing. Since he had the option, why wouldn't he target the group with only 8 remaining members? After all, according to this system, he was still by far the weakest. His little team was just 2 people now, while his enemy had 8. Surely he would still get the scoring advantage on his side. Without much thought, he entered the IV door and was greeted with a whirlwind of ice. Silas had already asked Lolaline what the levels were, so he was more than prepared. The first stair challenge was a direct battle, but this one. It was a test of will. They would alternate like this, back and forth, until the very end. This should be why the dungeon recommended 500 will to enter. Silas' will, however, was over 800 even without his extra 250% boost from madness. This time, the stairs were normal sized, but there was also far more than 9. The moment he raised his foot and touched down, a sharp cold penetrated into his very bones. Behind him, Lolaline shivered, hints of despair in her eyes. Teams were supposed to face off against this blizzard together. Wouldn't they just die doing this? Silas looked back and reached out his hand. He couldn't let this useful little support die. Not yet, anyway. Stay behind me. News that a human had infiltrated their coming-of-age ceremony had long since been spread to the rest of the Sylph Empire. Those that normally treated this matter as a formality showed slight hints of interest and the viewership began to slowly increase. Normally, the stair challenges wouldn't be broadcasted, while the team battles would be. So, when everyone saw the result of the first team battle, there was a harsh silence left behind. A certain old man stood behind a bonfire, looking down into the flickering flames as though the smoke didn't bother him at all. A level O, he thought to himself silently. At first, he hadn't thought much of it. If the human had happened to stumble into the dungeon when it had just appeared, it was still possible. But then there was Silas' little display of rune soul, and now. His victory against all odds. This was a problem. It was impossible to contact those on Earth right now, the restrictions were too stringent, let alone the fact the old man still wasn't sure exactly which planet Silas was from. However, what the Sylph did know was that this couldn't be allowed. The fact that Silas was level O and still so powerful meant only one thing. He knew more than he should. Chapter 390, Harsh Winds. Harsh winds buffeted against Silas' body, pulling against his torn-up clothing and sinking into his flesh. It lashed out like whips, the stinging pain drawing a fine line continuously. It felt almost like he was being burned from the outside, in. The pain made Silas frown slightly. Wasn't this supposed to be a test of will? So why was there so much physical pain involved? Silas still wasn't used to the idea that will could be a measured stat in the first place. But this aside, if the pain was so physical, the test felt a bit meaningless. That was because personal stats wouldn't be able to be isolated from one's will stat. The stronger a person was, the easier it would be to deal with these winds, and thus the lower their will would have to be to withstand this. Plus, according to Lolaline, these challenges would even be withstood by an entire group at the same time. That made it even less of a will challenge. Unless it's stat adjusted. Silas thought for a moment, then remembering that Lolaline said that the stair challenges weren't recorded, his skin began to flash with black scales. Lolaline was taken aback again, a strong lurch of fear turning her stomach over. How much strength was Silas still hiding? It really doesn't feel any different. So it is stat adjusted. Silas' scales faded, but in that case, how is it that they can work together? He looked back toward Lolaline was still following after him. I see, so these winds only target the person at the head of the group. So, presumably, they take turns taking the brunt of it. Silas looked up, finding that he still had quite a distance to climb. Sometimes, being correct was a burden. He had already realized earlier that the first challenge was a stroke of luck. Not every challenge would be so easy, and it seemed that he had stumbled into exactly that truth now. Taking a breath, he continued upward. Now that he understood what was happening, there was nothing to do but to trudge forward. Silas' jaw set as he took one step after another. His pace wasn't fast, but it was steady. At some unknown time, a blazing green flame had lit in his eye and it only burned fiercer as he continued forward. Silas had never seen this green flame before, but he could feel it quite clearly. That was when he seemed to realize something. His telekinesis flickered and formed a deflective shield before him. At first, he was using basic etherflow, but he quickly realized that that wasn't working. Ether wasn't the way. This was a path that tested his will, so Silas pushed, a force field of telekinesis spreading out from him. For a brief moment, there was a subtle relief, but this force field dissipated quickly and then dispersed entirely. It works, but my telekinesis seems too intangible. Silas pulled on his gluttony seed and then acted again. Whoosh, whoosh. The sound felt so familiar, as though wind was buffeting a glass door in the middle of a raging storm. The icy wind sliced into his barrier, but this time, it withstood the onslaught for much longer. However, all good things come to an end. Even with his gluttony seed, the barrier was soon shredded apart, and the pain he suffered increased exponentially. Luckily, it didn't seem to be out of retaliation. Unluckily, it was a natural progression of the stairs. It would only get more painful from here on out, especially without anyone to swap out for him. Although he could use Lolaline, he needed her in top condition and he could feel something odd about this place. Silas took another step forward and his heart shuddered. There was a wavering in his mind that reminded him of the assault his will suffered in the Slithering Madness dungeon. If this continued, his will would actually begin to plummet. Slithering Madness. That was when my telekinesis first awakened. There was too much about his telekinesis he didn't understand. Why did it have such weight limitations? Why couldn't it stack properly? What about the gluttony seed allowed it to increase in strength? What changes in himself increased the weight it could carry? The questions were endless, and this wasn't the first time he had thought of them. Don't use the gluttony seed. Silas came to a decision, forming another force field to fight against the winds, but this time, he did so continuously, forming force field after force field of telekinesis. His strength was dispersed over a large area, and the blazing green flames in his eyes seemed like a weakly struggling ember in the middle of an endless tundra. No, there's definitely something special here. Silas clenched his teeth as he continued forward, contradictory beads of sweat falling down his brow. Bang! Silas struck out with a palm, guiding it with his telekinesis. He coated the strike in his will, trying to lend it more power. But ultimately, the power of his arm overwhelmed it, making his telekinesis insignificant. This happened all too often. No matter how powerful his telekinesis, he couldn't properly stack it to his attacks, at least not without basic etherflow. But even when he used basic etherflow, the stack wasn't perfect and it ended up in an average of his physical stats and his telekinesis. This weakened it greatly. As though this wasn't enough of a waste, he had to be cautious with how he used it in battle or else the lack of weight behind his telekinesis would severely hamper the damage. By now, his telekinesis should be so far beyond his physical stats, and yet it could still be mostly used as a support. A grunt came from Silas' lips as a line of blood dribbled down the corner of his lips. His fighting intent flared as he took another step, and then another. He began raining down a series of palms, trying to trigger a change, something, anything. But all he received in return were harsher winds. Chapter 391, Failed to Analyze. Silas gasped for breath at the top of the stairs, his eyes bloodshot and his heart practically beating out of his chest. He felt like there was a scorching heat ripping through his throat and his veins were completely on fire. Loweline cast a healing support skill on him to help him rejuvenate, and it was only then that some of that scorching pain was weakened somewhat. All the way up the stairs, Silas hadn't commanded Loweline to act once because he was saving it. Now stuck in a familiar bubble, it was only right that he benefit from his enslavement contract. Taking deep breaths, Silas hurriedly sat down. Maybe he had pushed himself too hard because there wasn't anyone here either. It was clear that he was the first to arrive once again. Regardless, this was the only leisure time he'd have, so he needed to take advantage quickly. He pulled out Sergen's corpse, inwardly crossing his fingers. The first time he tried to use the system to take genes from a sylph assuming Azrael really was one, it had failed. He could only hope this time that it would work. He had a feeling that the reason it didn't work with Azrael was because of whatever oddity allowed him to appear on Earth in the first place. He was banking on the fact it would be different this time. Luckily, he was correct. Sergen Aerovane. Genes detected. Unique gene detected. Failed to analyze unique gene. Bronze gene, 2, strength, F2, constitution, F3, dexterity, F2, speed, F4, intelligence, F3, wisdom, F2, charisma, F. Attempt assimilation. Yes, no. Excellent. The moment Silas saw the wisdom gene he needed, he used extricate on the wisdom gene. He ignored all the stuff about unique genes even though it was the first time he was seeing such a thing. If he was correct, this unique gene was to the Aerovanes was the Grimblade lineage gene was to the Grimblades. Now that he thought about it, maybe there was a way to extricate such a gene as well, but it hardly mattered since it was certainly at least bronze and he didn't have the space for it anyway. Plus, his luck was telling him that it certainly wouldn't be easy. If he had to guess, there was no way a family would allow others to benefit from their blood, sweat and tears. Gene crystals were incredibly valuable, especially on a non-summoning world. Earth was in a special state of accelerated growth, so they were relatively easier to find. And yet, after risking his life again and again, Silas only managed to gather 3 so far, 2 of which were lucky gains from what was effectively gambling. If these worlds could manipulate and twist the runes of Earth, and genes were just a highly complex form of runes, then why wouldn't they be able to put their unique genes under lock and key so that others couldn't just kill their descendants to steal the talent in their bloodlines? These were all periphery thoughts to Silas, because his complete focus was on the Winter's Edge gene talent. This experience made him realize just how rare gene talents were. This was the first time he had stumbled into a gene talent since his very first encounters in the trial. He had already lost count of the number of beasts he had even killed by now. Of course, part of the problem was that he had been relying entirely on extricate until now, so there might be gene talents that he could have had, that he missed out on because of this. But even if that was true, they still had a rarity he couldn't ignore. And now, he was gaining one that was absolutely perfect for his current path. If he was correct, this gene talent might even fix the attack weakness of his ice poison path. There was a shudder that went through Silas' body as he pressed the genes into himself. Loweline couldn't even understand what was happening. The runes were too complex, and every time she tried to look at them closely, she got a splitting headache. In the end, her vision blurred and it ended up looking like Silas was just using an odd devouring skill to take motes of light from 2 bodies and press them into himself. "Give me your ether stones," Silas called out. Though it hurt, Loweline had no choice but to oblige. N-O-V-L-B-J-N.C, Silas had never seen ether stones before, but according to the transmutation beast skin, he could use them in place of his own ether to trigger it. He pulled out what ice poison corpses he had remaining and plundered all of Loweline's wealth to convert them all into pills. He had already stripped them all of genes, so they weren't the best, but something was still better than nothing. There was a great pressure on Silas' body. He knew that it was because he didn't originally have the genes to trigger the gene talent in the first place. Right now, he was trying to cheat, forcing out potential hidden deep within himself. Silas suddenly coughed, frozen shards of blood flying from his mouth as his gaze dimmed. He grit his teeth, realizing that he was in trouble. He had relied on the transmuted pill of the Arctic Emperor Bear to get to this point, but that energy had long been used up. The pills he had now weren't enough. He couldn't help but regret a bit, not taking this risk, but rather not killing a few of the Arctic king bears before he entered the dungeon so he would have some contingency. However, he hadn't done that because even though he had defeated their emperor, there were simply too many of them. There was a reason that the Arctic king bears hadn't taken out what remained of the Arctic king cobras after they lost their emperor, but rather suppressed them instead. They would suffer too great of a loss trying to take over the whole ice poison lake for themselves. Not enough. Press forward. Scylla's will blazed in his eyes. Even after going through the stairs, he still seemed to have more to give. With wild abandon, he began extricating intelligence and wisdom genes from General Aileen and Sergen, pouring them into his body regardless of the waste. It was at that moment that the teams began to appear. Scylla's body shuddered and the 4 teams flickered and vanished. When his vision cleared, he was half keeled over, with Lolaline to his back and a group of 8 practically rabid wolves staring at him. There was nothing Varyu's team wanted more than to tear him to pieces. Chapter 392 Backlash. Scylla's gaze flashed. He knew that it was a risk to do this, but with what he knew about the later rounds, he also realized that he didn't have much of a choice in the matter. He was ready. At that moment, several swirling tornadoes of icy blue wind appeared high above them. They formed a connected formation of sorts. As they spun faster, they influenced the wind in the surroundings, causing it to shoot up, growing sharper and fiercer. During every team battle, the landscape would be decided by the stair challenge that preceded it. The first team battle had a point system related to the spirit wolves, but this time the landscape would be pervaded by the fierce winds they had fought against on the staircase. It was clear that this time Varyu's team had taken their time. On the one hand, this allowed Scylla to reach the waiting zone first and also trigger the genes he needed for his gene talent. But on the other, because they had cleverly planned out the turns on the stairs, they were much fresher now. The moment they appeared, they seemed to have already decided how to act. Their support locked onto Lolaline, ready to cast counter skills against her the moment she triggered any skills. This was obviously a rare area of effect countering skill, one that Scylla had simply never seen before but had learned about through questioning Lolaline. Lolaline was the superior support, but this young man, simply known as River, might have been inferior in support, but had an array of abilities that made him valuable to the team nonetheless. And this was one of them. Go, Scylla spoke coldly. Lolaline did as she was told. She wanted to remind Scylla that she would be counted, but there was no room to refuse Scylla's command nonetheless. Plus, she had to remind herself that she was just a slave, why should she try hard to kill her own people? As expected, as the group was swiftly closing the gap, River's gaze flashed as his counter skill activated. Lolaline stumbled back, her ether reversing its flow as she almost coughed up a mouthful of blood. Varyu sneered. Fire. There were no beasts to deal with this time. So long as they could withstand the harsh and sharp winds, they would survive. When their will hit rock bottom, the system would teleport them out. But until then, they could kill as they pleased. Varyu was working as fast as possible because he didn't want Scylla's will to give out first. If that happened, how could he kill him? Icicles formed in the air in pairings. Scylla's eyes couldn't help but flash. One of the icicles burst apart, forming a protective shield around the second that supported it against the strong wind. Then, they rushed forward. This was the first time Scylla had seen someone capable of manipulating the intent of skills to suit the environment. Well, other than himself. Lolaline had been able to tell him about the skills, but what she couldn't do was give him every detail about how they might use it. Still, he reacted quickly. He tossed out the idea of using the strong winds to his advantage, at least in part. Then, he dug deep, circulating his ether into a familiar domain. Less than Arctic King's domain greater than. The icicles in the sky rushed toward him from 6 different directions, piercing through his ever-expanding domain with the viciousness of a reaper's call to death. N-O-V-L-B-J-N.C. Scylla's activated less than Arctic howl mutant the instant they were about to pierce through him and they froze in the air. He stumbled forward, his body still not cooperating fully. Another rain of icicles formed in the skies, more numerous than before, and seemingly fiercer. Again, Scylla commanded. Lolaline's head was still spinning from the first counter, but she was forced to obey again. River frowned, but reacted again. It wasn't the time to be kind-hearted. Lolaline coughed up a mouthful of blood and she fell to her knee, her small body shaking. As the second rain of icicles fell, the group had finally crossed the last of the distance. Vayu's gaze lit with a vicious light. He timed his stride perfectly. The second rain of icicles would pierce through Scylla's first, then he would launch his attack right after. Even if Scylla's had another defensive skill prepared, it was impossible that he would be able to use it twice in such quick succession. As expected, Scylla's opened his mouth and roared once again, activating less than Arctic howl mutantance again. The sneer on Vayu's expression deepened. The second rain of icicles froze around Scylla's and Vayu burst through the line of defense right afterward. Right at that moment, Scylla's body gave off a pulsing light. All the volatile energy within him stabilized at once and he stood to his full height. Again, Scylla's commanded calmly. Lolaline, kneeling to a single leg, couldn't help but shudder. Unfortunately, her body acted on its own once again. River's eyes turned bloodshot, but he still prepared his counter skill, activating it once again. The team's formation bore down on Scylla's, Vayu taking the vanguard, River hanging the furthest back, and their remaining 6 members closing off his escape paths. In fact, 2 had shot right for Lolaline with every intention of restraining her, confident that River would counter her again. They could all feel the effects of Scylla's domain, but they felt that it was nothing more than a joke. This level of ice poison. They were entirely immune to it. Lolaline's eyes flashed, activating a skill once again despite the pain she was under. But to everyone's shock, it wasn't a support skill, but rather Lolaline's only attack skill. It was a much weaker version of the icicle skill that had targeted Scylla's twice now, and compared to the dozen the caster could form, Lolaline was only able to form 2, 1 for each of her attackers. However, it was hopeless. River still acted first, his counter skill drilling into Lolaline's body once again. His eyes were practically pulsing with a crimson bed of snakes. This time, Lolaline might really die from the backlash. Chapter 393 Your Fault. Vayu swung down a swift sword right at Scylla's neck just as River's counter skill descended. However, it was then the situation changed. Scylla's didn't seem to see Vayu's sword at all, his gaze blazing with a green light. River felt his mind shake. Stunning Spike, FF, Skill, Silver. Young mind is sharper than others, so much so that you strip them of even their own ability to think and reflect clearly. Cost is 7 units of ether in exchange for 1 second of confusion. For every 10% gap in will, cost will decrease by 1 unit, with the lowest cost being 0.1 ether unit. Scylla's timing was perfect. River's counter skill was only halfway done when less than Stunning Spike descended, drilling into his mind. Scylla's had already learned how to use his telekinesis to interrupt skills in the past. But after observing River's counter skill twice, he couldn't find the crucial runes to target. That was when he realized that it was because it was a mental attack and he was looking in the wrong place. At the moment less than Stunning Spike activated, he poured his tangible will into it, boosting it tremendously. The instant it landed, streams of blood rushed from River's nose. Shiiing. Vayu didn't have time to realize what happened. His sword cut into Scylla's neck, with a twist of his wrist, he was ready to send his head flying into the air. Only for a pauldron to appear right at his wrist. Again, it appeared from nowhere, and once again, it was in a perfect blind spot. Blood spurted from Scylla's neck, but the vicious blow to Vayu's wrist slowed his slashing strike. Scylla's leaned backward, sending out a kick toward Vayu's chest. At the same time, Lolaline's 2 icicles were successfully formed, catching her 2 teammates off guard and piercing right through their heads. Bang! Scylla stumbled backward at the same time Vayu did, but he was ready unlike his opponent. In a swift motion that seemed to all happen in one breath, the entire situation reversed. A thick layer of ether stemmed the flow of blood from his neck, another pauldron and 2 shin guards appeared, and as though that wasn't enough, the icicles that seemed frozen in the air suddenly reversed the direction. Less than Arctic howl mutant was only able to freeze attacks for a brief instant. So why did the icicles stay in the air for so long? It was because in that brief pause, Scylla's had already stripped them from their caster's control. The others thought that this was the effect of his defensive skill, when in reality it was the actions of his telekinesis. However, not only did Scylla's take the icicles for himself, he poured most of the effects of his domain into them, strengthening them from the Frostbane rune of the Sylphs to his own Freeze rune. The skills became his own, gaining the boost from less than Arctic King's domain and zipping out even faster under the control of his telekinesis. They appeared before the 4 remaining members, ignoring Vayu and River. Too fast, too sudden. They had all been encircling Silas, looking to bite out a piece of his flesh. They had even weaved around the icicles, trying to get closer to him. None of them could have ever expected to be pierced from the back. Some of them reacted fast, using defensive skills, but it wasn't enough. Those that managed to survive the instant death found the ice poison rushing through their veins, and the element they thought they had such immunity to suddenly became the bane of their existence, freezing them completely in place. With his mind, Silas commanded Lolaline again. A flood of energy fueled his body as his stats were boosted by 50% once again, all while Lolaline rushed toward the frozen river with only one obvious intention in mind. Blood flowed down Silas' body, but he appeared before Vayu, who was standing in a bit of a daze. He couldn't seem to understand how all of this had happened. In one moment, victory was in hand. And in the next. It's all your fault. Vayu's eyes bulged with a sudden fury. It's all your fault. He roared, swinging down his sword like a madman. But he realized quickly that his ice poison wasn't listening to him. Clang. Pauldron and sword met, a fiery blaze of green light enveloping their crimson hue. They rebounded away beneath Vayu's strength, but they recovered quickly, lashing out again and again. Vayu was on his back foot, a vicious series of sharp combinations coming from Silas. Every time his fists moved, the pauldrons descended. Every time his feet whipped out, the shin guards would slice through the air with the edge of blades. It looked as though he was shadow boxing with the air, and yet every attack was as real as it could get for Vayu. The frustration was quickly boiling over. The heaviness of the armor was quickly depleting the durability of his sword, and Silas was too far away to deal real damage to him. A roar of frustration came from Vayu and a mysterious energy surged out from him. This time, it wasn't ice poison, but rather seemed to be more pure ice than anything else. His body cracked apart and suddenly shattered into countless pieces. Then, it suddenly reformed before Silas and far out of the way of his pauldrons and shin guards. The frosty energy bore down, cutting towards Silas swiftly. It seemed that by taking a step back, Vayu had freed himself of the oppression of Silas' domain. It could work on ice poison, but it was limited on other paths. However, Silas' expression was as cool as Vayu's ice. He sidestepped the sword, unleashing a counter-punch. He stepped forward again, drawing an elbow across Vayu's chin and sending his head snapping to the side. His second elbow was about to unleash a vicious thrusting blow, but his visualization caught sight of a dagger appearing in Vayu's second hand, aiming right for his liver. Silas' elbow changed its path mid-air, turning from a piercing blow into another slash. His hip spun with it, dodging out of the way of the blade. It wasn't enough. The blade drew across his skin. However, it didn't pierce into his organs. An icy energy poured into him, eating into his body. Silas felt it immediately, a vicious glint lighting his eyes. He pinned Vayu's arm to his hip with an arm, stopping him from using the dagger again. Pulling back with Vayu still firmly in his grip, he threw the sylph off balance before driving a knee right into his gut. All the air in Vayu's body exited at once. His wrist had already been injured during that earlier pauldron strike. Greatly weakened, the combination attacks caused him to lose grip of his blade entirely. Silas suddenly released his arm and Vayu stumbled back, only for Silas to unleash a violent roundhouse kick right into his head. Vayu's skull deformed beneath Silas' shin, the sound of popping tendons and shattering bone creating a symphony of death. Vayu's head whipped back so hard his neck snapped. Slowly, his eyes dimmed, the last light of despair slowly fading. He had been completely overwhelmed in a contest of skill. Doom. He fell to the ground in a heap, leaving only the sounds of the howling winds, Silas' heaving breaths, and Lolaline's sobs over River's corpse. Chapter 394, Leave. Silas finally settled his breathing and calmly gathered all the corpses. The one thing that he hadn't had a chance to go over were all the treasures on their bodies. He hadn't even had the time to scan Sergen's daggers, and he certainly wouldn't have the time to go through all of this stuff. The shame of it was that he was certain that there might at least be some stuff that was useful to him here. But the time crunch was too great. Right now, he had secured the right to choose his opponent first during the next round. But if he was too slow, he wouldn't have that right again. He had no idea where Vyu's strength ranked amongst the other teams, but what he did know was that the first to make it through the Spirit Wolf trials when they all went all out wasn't Vyu, but rather Eroina and her team. Without Rune Soul, the teams had to rely on their raw combat strength to make it through that first trial. So, if he extrapolated that, Eroina Galesong's team was likely his greatest danger. If he could avoid battling with her, that would be for the best. And in order to do that, he would need to capitalize on being first every step of the way. Otherwise, he wouldn't have the right to continue choosing IV and skipping the team battle any longer. Let's go. Silas put everything away into his madness key and turned to leave. He didn't have the time to care for Lololine's emotions. Even if she was a close friend, he wouldn't have the bandwidth to spare for her right now, let alone the fact she would certainly not be shedding these tears if he was the one to die. Lololine instinctively wanted to refuse, but who would have thought that Silas wouldn't say this casually but rather directly command her through the enslavement contract. The feeling of not being able to control her body like she wanted to make her want to keel over and vomit, but ultimately even that didn't seem to be under her control. Focus on healing yourself, Silas commanded again. Then, he stepped into the portal and appeared before a familiar set of 4 doors. Once again, he was alone. This was the only chance he had to extend the distance. After the stair challenge, he was forced to wait for all the groups to appear. But after the team battle, he could directly enter the next stair challenge. This was where he had to claim his advantage in time. If he was fast enough, then maybe he would have time to look through his spoils of battle. The world swirled around Silas again and he found a tall set of stairs before him again. The last stair challenge was related to wool, so this one should be combat again. He already had his pauldrons summoned as he leapt up. Silas landed as Lololine was forced to follow after him. This will be a bit troublesome. A growl echoed in Silas' ears. The first thing he saw was a pair of yellow eyes, then came the bristling white fur, then he saw the beast's entire form. It was an ape with long arms and short legs. It had the body composition of an orangutan, but the usual face of a monkey. However, this wasn't particularly the problem. Silas' Rune Soul and Enchanted Scholar were already activated, just in hopes of getting a chance to take advantage of the situation like he had before. Ironically, that was what allowed him to see it. It was hard to explain, but he felt like the creature was mimicking him. It had actually swapped out Frostbane for Silas' current inferior Ice Poison rune, the 32 Foundation one he had gotten from the Arctic King Cobras. That much was fine considering it was weaker than what Silas was capable of. But then it sensed Lololine's appearance and then a second ape appeared. This one began to emit fluctuations that were only common on her and that confirmed Silas' speculation. The question was, how far did this mimicking go? Did it copy skills? If he used Rune Soul to summon his stronger Slow and Freeze Ice Poison runes, would they copy that as well? He had questioned Lololine about all of this much earlier, but the problem was that the finer details of the actual trials were mostly unknown. They had some experience to lean on from their predecessors, but there would always be small changes from year to year that couldn't be perfectly relied upon. There has to be a mechanism through which they're copying. So long as I find a way to counter that. SHUU. The first ape suddenly shot forward and Silas' pupils constricted. Its physical stats were way beyond what one would expect from a sylph, even closing in on what Silas had seen from General Aileen, though not quite there. It seemed that they were matching their already oppressive physical stats, with the overwhelming mental capability of the sylphs. Silas took a breath. This battle would be troublesome. There was an eerie sort of silence over the sylph camp. The bonfire continued to rage on, and the elder sylph stood in the very same place, staring into the flames as though the smoke didn't bother him in the slightest. The weight of solemnity was only increasing with every passing moment. A cool wind passed by, swishing through the trees. It only increased the feeling of sheer hollowness. At that moment, there was a flash and a figure appeared. At first, it was just one, but very quickly, there were 3. They moved like blizzards, frosty air wrapping around them with the sharpness of blades. This isn't a place you can be, the elder sylph said calmly. Leave. The 3 figures didn't reply. Instead, they suddenly launched a fierce attack. The elder sylph's eyes sharpened and a blizzard-like aura erupted from him as well. The sound of battle echoed through the hollow forest. Chapter 395, Worthless. What do you all think you're doing? The elder sylph gasped for breath, a palm pressed to his bleeding chest. He was even paler now than he had been in the past, and now his white robes had a patch of quickly spreading blackness. The three figures still didn't reply. In response, the elder sylph could only laugh, trying to play with the bottom line of the system as a mere E-grade race. You all overestimate yourselves. Whatever game you're playing at, you'll just end up the pawn on someone else's board. There was only the barest hint of emotion on the faces of the three when this was said, but that didn't stop them from dealing the death blow to the elder sylph. Once he had breathed his last, the three of them stood around the bonfire and looked toward one another for the first time. Until now, they had communicated seamlessly with hardly a word between them as they took the man down. But now, they seemed to be negotiating something with their eyes. Eventually, two of them looked toward the last and there was a hint of resignation in his gaze. With a clench of his jaw, he stuck his hand forward and into the bonfire. Screams suddenly filled the forest. Cursed vein patterns ran how his arm and quickly made it to his heart. In that instant, the screams stopped. But the curse didn't. It continued to rampage through his body until it had grown so thick that it looks as though the man's skin had become green. His body was entirely stiff, not twitching even a single muscle as the curse finally invaded the dullness of his eyes and his brain. Crack. Fissures began to appear across the man's body and suddenly he cracked apart. What remained of his body floated off into the harsh winds, scattering across the forest to be forgotten. The two remaining men continued to look down at the bonfire as though their companion hadn't just died. Their focus was trained ahead, not wanting to miss a single moment of what would happen next. But then, the both of them shuddered. They looked up into the skies at once to see a fissure, if it could even be described that way. It was too perfect, as though the building blocks of reality had been carefully peeled apart in layers of perfectly straight lines that could be seamlessly put back together as though nothing at all had happened at all. The eyes of the two men widened in fear. How could this happen? This was certainly not supposed to happen. The perfect fissure opened in the tear duct shape of an eye, and soon there was a swirl of energy right at the center that formed an iris. The realization hit them too late. But even if they realized seconds earlier, it wouldn't have changed a single thing. The beam of light descended and silence fell into the forest once more. Flames flickered in the bonfire, dancing without someone to manage it. A single corpse lay staring off into space, its eyes dull and lifeless. All the while, the situation on Scylla's side had changed. Scylla's had been just about to clash with the apes when he felt a shudder. His body swayed and coughed up a mouthful of blood. All of a sudden, the pressure in this combat level increased several times and icicles began to form across his skin. Scylla's reacted fast, using his rune soul to try and disperse them as quickly as possible, but while the runes themselves were far weaker than his control, the ether backing them was too powerful. It felt like he was facing off a behemoth whose ether was hundreds of times more pure than his own. No matter how strong his rune soul, his wisdom and overall mental was too weak to support it at this level. Still, he grinded his teeth, pushing himself hard. He activated his Winter's Edge gene talent for the first time, still not familiar with all that it could do, but knowing he had to rely on it for the extra bit of ambient ether control he needed to keep himself alive. Unfortunately, Lolaline wasn't nearly so lucky. She fought back valiantly, but after the second, she was already encased in ice. After the third, all life had been completely snuffed out from her. Even if she was defrosted, there would be nothing but a corpse remaining. The strength of the apes multiplied several times over in an instant. Scylla's quickly used less than King's Bind and one, and the last charge, less than King's Shield and the other. Luckily, less than King's Bind worked. Unluckily, the remaining white ape smashed through less than King's Shield as though it was a worthless, thin sheet of ice. It lashed out, slapping at him, N-O-V-L-B-J-N.C, Scylla's could only gather all the ether he could, crossing his arms over his chest and activated less than Arctic Howl at the same time. Boom. His arms became a mangled mess and his body flew out faster than he had ever run in his life. The Basilisk King's fusion cancelled mid-flight, his injuries too heavy for it to succeed. He crashed down heavily, blood spurting out of his mouth. What happened? These were the only words he could think of before the white ape continued barreling toward him. It also didn't look like the second white ape would be stalled for much longer at all. It felt like death was the only way out. That was when Silas saw the notification. Normally, he would completely tune it out in battle. He knew how distracting it would be. But right now, when he was grasping at any straw to find a path to survival, it was impossible for him to ignore it. However, what he saw when he opened it made his eyes widen. The system is watching you, System Breaker. Quest received. War of Worlds, Legendary. Your dungeon has been tampered with by outside interferences and your life no longer seems to be in your hands. Follow the path of the progenitor and control your own destiny. Silas was shaken. This was completely worthless to him. Chapter 396, Useless Hint. The problem set in for Silas instantly. This notification wasn't helpful at all. If anything, it was just further confirming just how screwed he was. This was the first time he had ever seen a quest so highly rated. The closest he had come was a silver quest, but even that wasn't necessarily representative of much at all. Silas had already come to realize that quest difficulty was set on a scale of relativity. A silver quest now might only be a common or even fragmented quest in the future. It wasn't just a relativity decided by power, but also by scope as well. For example, a profession quest to refine a specific elixir might be silver, but it was incomparable to a combat quest of the same level in terms of difficulty or danger. There were countless factors that might decide the grade of a quest. However, a legendary quest, this might be a firm, unmovable standard. Although Silas couldn't be sure, he felt his heart leap out of his chest. His luck was practically roaring at him to run the other direction, but did he even have a choice in this matter? There was no eject button. The apes were swift, too swift. Even with Silas' current thinking speed, he hardly had time to finish these thoughts before the one he had failed to bind had already closed the distance by more than half. Had it not sent him flying so far, it would already be barreling down on him. That was when Silas felt another notification trigger. System reward activated. Quest hint detected. Silas felt that he couldn't read and react fast enough. He had gathered more system rewards since the system first started watching him, but they had laid dormant without any movement. He assumed that they would have to trigger like they had the first time. For example, his first system reward allowed him to awaken 3 legendary path professions instead of just 1. Now, a second system reward had triggered, giving him a quest hint. Quest hint used. The clandestine ape is a special race of beasts cloaked in mystery. They are born with the bodies of warriors and increase in strength without much effort. For some unknown reason, their ether pathways are barren, and their intelligence is low, making it difficult for most of them to achieve anything. However, generations ago, a genius left his mark in history. They know him as the clandestine scholar, a man of unknown origins, but well-known merit. Since that day, Silas cursed in a rare instant, forcing himself up through a combination of flexing his legs, torso, and telekinesis all at once. He couldn't push himself up with his broken arms and could only dive to the side. He didn't even have the time to read this hint. On top of that, soon, the second ape was going to break free of less than King's Bind and his situation would become several times worse in an instant. He grit his teeth, circulating his ether and exploding forth with less than Arctic King's domain greater than. With a roar, he activated less than Arctic Howl mutant greater than, forcing it to expand wider and wider under the control of his rune's soul realm. He poured everything he had into it, no longer having the mind to care about his stamina. The ape had already leapt past Silas and its forward momentum was still in the complete other direction. The introduction about this race's stupidity was clearly to Silas' advantage. It hadn't even considered that Silas might dodge. The creature was hit with a wave of pulsing light and it froze in place for a brief instant as Silas continued to dash forward, splitting his mind in two, one to continue reading the seemingly useless hint, and the second to try and kill the second ape before it broke free of less than King's Bind greater than. Since that day, the clandestine ape became known for something else, becoming the experimental subject that all powers pined after. They had strong, robust bodies, and were likewise the perfect blank slate, allowing countless paths to be etched onto them without resistance. I'm not going to make it. I'm too slow. The thought sunk into Silas' gut. There was no way for him to make it back to the second ape before it broke free of less than King's Bind greater than. If he kept running, he would just be throwing himself to his death. To make matters worse, the second ape was still over 30 meters from him, so he couldn't even rely on his telekinesis. The stabilizing bracelet had already used up its 3 charges, and though he could summon the Basilisk King to load more skills into it, it still took the Basilisk King too long to cast these skills as its mastery was too low. Silas couldn't guarantee that he could protect himself. If he lost the Basilisk King, his chances of survival would plummet to 0. He looked down at his mangled arms, and the pain of trying to run at full speed while they swung made a dense sweat pour down his brow. Unfortunately, he didn't even have the luxury. The instant he changed directions, running toward a distance furthest from the 2 apes, the second ape broke free. Unleashing a howl, it lumbered after Silas, using its long arms as levers as it bounded forward. The clandestine ape is the perfect experimental subject. It can be used to test skills, paths, genes, and even comprehensions. Of course, this will be limited by the grade of the clandestine ape, but powers often breed their own powerful lines of clandestine apes to experiment with unique gene mutations they might want to implement into their bloodlines in the future. That's all. That was it. There was nothing left in the quest hint. At that moment, there was a sudden rush of ether. From his right, the second ape was casting several icicles into existence. From his left, the first ape had cast less than Arctic Kings. Domain greater than. The domain clashed with his own and the icicles swiftly appeared to his side. Chapter 397, Death. Sila's eyes became ice cold. Death. It was a scent that he was becoming more and more familiar with. The first time he had met it in this world, well and truly, his mind almost collapsed. It was the most pathetic moment of his life, and it was a brand that was still fiercely stamped into his heart. Just thinking of that moment filled him with untold rage. He knew why he had felt that fear back then. He hadn't awakened to himself, he still thought of himself as a normal earthling, as a man who would be willing to go back to normal life if this summoning nonsense was to end right this moment. But now he knew that that wasn't him. If he had a button right before him now to reset everything to how it had once been, he knew that not only would he not press it, he would likely destroy it. Adrenaline filled his limbs and his brain churned. He didn't believe that it was possible for the system to give him a useless hint, least of all a useless system reward. Pressure descended on Silas from all directions. It wasn't just the attacks, or the domain, it was the world itself that was still continuously trying to kill him. The frigid cold was slowly turning his mangled mess of a hand blue, and his toes weren't escaping this fate either. Ice poison seeped into his bones, but Silas' gaze was becoming brighter and brighter. Suddenly, Silas ducked and rolled, holding his arms tightly to his body to avoid the damage becoming any worse. He used less than Arctic howl mutant again the instant he stood to his feet. At the same time, his domain became more aggressive, eating away at the less than Arctic King's domain of the first ape. The icicles froze in the air. Because Lolaline was the template the ape had used, they were far weaker than the ones her partner had used. Madness flared and Silas shattered the icicles apart with his rune soul, disrupting the runes inside the skill. He was copying exactly what Lolaline's partner had done, but this time, instead of using it to protect a second icicle against the wind, he was using it to obscure the second ape's vision. At that moment, a targeted less than stunning spike pierced right through the first ape's head and Madness spilled over. Ice and ice shards flew through the air, casting a pale fog over the region. It wasn't nearly dense enough to obstruct vision, but all Silas needed was a small distraction. The eyes of the clandestine apes went red as they howled into the air. They had no resistance to Madness at all, immediately losing their minds. Silas dashed out of the fog of ice, blood flowing down his body. Boom! At that moment, the 2 apes clashed with one another. And yet, rather than sitting around and hoping one of them died, Silas' foot actually pivoted into the ground. The instant the 2 apes were locked onto one another, Silas dashed back into the pale fog, rounding to the back of one and leaping up. There was a slight of madness in Silas' eyes, one tempered by an eerie calm. His green irises practically left lasers of light in their wake, a dense flickering flame hidden within them. Silas flicked one of his arms out and his forearm snapped back into place with a sickening crush. Blood gushed and a bruise began to pull around the wound. By this point, his arm was already 3 times the size it should have been. Yet, rather than making him look stronger, it made him look like a mangled mess. Right then, Silas did something entirely unexpected and landed on the rampaging ape's back. The apes were barely much taller than him at 2.5 meters, so there wasn't much room at all. Yet, Silas didn't hesitate in the slightest, his injured arm pressing right into its ice-cold fur. Bang, bang, bang. Silas was rocked, almost falling off the beast's back. He could only react quickly, wrapping his legs around its waist tightly. But there was a searing pain that came right after just as quickly. The hard blows of the second ape landed on one of his ankles, breaking it. Silas' eyes bulged and his bloodshot gaze practically pulled over with the crimson liquid. But in a feat of earth-shattering will, he tightened his hold around the ape's waist and pressed down on its back. Extricate. Silas' roar was practically like that of a wild beast. Extricate didn't work on living beings, it wasn't meant to in the first place. Not only did it require time, the main problem was that in a living being, the variables were too numerous. There were countless minor changes that happened in one's body during life, making it impossible to lock down genes while a person was living and breathing. That was part of what made mastering rune flesh so magical, at least for yourself, it was like circumventing this rule. However, Silas seemed to have disregarded this rule entirely, using it on someone, or rather, some beast other than himself. And it actually worked. A blinding light came out of the ape's body, its rampaging roars not ceasing for even a moment as it clasped palms with the second ape. As Silas fell backward, the domain of ice actually vanished around him. It was then that he was certain. The first ape had lost its ability to copy his ice poison. A savage light flashed in Silas' eyes as he rolled to the side and out of the way of a stomping foot of the ape. Less than chilling scythe mutant greater than. His swelling arm drew a line across the air and a curved blade of icy blue shot upward and right into the roaring mouth of the second ape. Bang! The second ape had used Lolaline as a template. It simply had no ability to resist Silas' ice poison. Suddenly blood began to fly through the skies as the two beasts began to tear each other apart. Silas' eyes glowed, drawing another blade through the air. Chapter 398, Warm Blood. Silas' less than chilling scythe metant rushed forward, cutting through the air. And yet, it wasn't aimed at one of the apes at all. Instead, it suddenly curled, exploding on the ground beneath them and kicking up even more fog. The ice poison erupted along the ground and the number of ice poison runes in the atmosphere multiplied several times over. Silas poured it all into his less than Arctic King's domain greater than, pumping both apes with a continuous series of damage. They both were so locked in combat and so foolish they didn't understand that the damage was coming from an external source. They fought valiantly, but the first ape was likewise the first to fall, veins of blue poison pulsing in its eyes as it collapsed. The second ape's eyes snapped towards Silas. By this point, Silas was standing just 20 meters away, a matter of a second or two to this beast. It took a step towards Silas, lunging at him. A shadow cast over Silas' body as he looked up and into the maw of the beast, its sharp canines protruding to take a bite out of his face. Silas took a single step back. Bang! The second ape collapsed to the ground, a swirl of ice kicking up around it and buffeting against Silas' face. However, Silas didn't so much as blink, his breathing being left as the only noise other than the howling wind. He looked toward the second stair. It rose high into the skies and must have been at least 10 meters in height. That was right, this was just the first staircase. There was still 8 more to go. Silas looked toward the gene he had extricated. It had already begun to dissipate in the air as he hadn't been able to pay any attention to it, and taking it into his body would have certainly put him in a daze he couldn't afford. However, now that he could focus on it somewhat, the dissipation process stopped. In the end, his taboo bond talent had saved his life. He racked his brains trying to understand what the hint might have meant, but in the end, he concluded only one thing. The system was just trying to inform him about the apes he was facing off against and it was up to him to find their weakness. Some of those weaknesses were obvious. They were dumb creatures, for one. That meant that his madness was super effective on them, but that wasn't nearly enough. Even if he used his madness to make them fight it out against one another, one of them would definitely survive. Sure, a one-on-one battle against an injured opponent would be easier. But, he was alone and likely to be even more heavily injured. Plus, he would then be up against an opponent that could copy his skills and gain immunity against them. The odds of victory even in that case were nil. Then there was the problem of the later stairs. Without Lolaline, he would be alone, so that would presumably mean that there'd be just one ape to face off against in the later rounds. At that point, who would he be making it fight against? If anything, his madness would only make things more difficult for him, not easier. That was when something stuck with him. The malleability of the apes. They changed their genes and affinities practically mid-battle as though they were all-consuming sponges. So was the reverse also true. If they could accept things so easily, was it likewise possible to take things away from them? In the end, his gamble had worked. He used extricate on the core gene they were using to copy his abilities and ripped it out of their bodies. According to their description, this shouldn't be an ability they had naturally, or else it wouldn't have taken the clandestine scholar to observe this. There would have already been a bunch of clandestine apes running around, copying everyone's abilities. Instead, they should just have a very unique body composition that allowed this to be possible. This gene should have been added to them after the fact. Looking at it, although it was impossible for Silas to analyze fully, it made his heart tremble somewhat. This could hardly be called a gene, it was more like a cancerous tumor. In fact, if he was correct, having this gene in him probably severely cut down the lifespan of these creatures. Silas was more right than he knew. If a clandestine ape was used properly, it probably wouldn't live more than 3 years at the very most. Some had especially pitiful lives, only living a handful of months before they were run into the ground. This gene took advantage of the unique characteristics, but there was a reason it only worked on them and no one else. Silas' breaths continued to heave. There's no other choice. If I don't take a break here, I will lose my life. He decisively gave up on trying to get first the rest of the way, looking down at his body. He wasn't even sure if it was possible to heal all of this. According to the rules, he would only have 50% more than the time of the second last to arrive at the end of the stair challenge. Otherwise, he would be disqualified. He had no way of knowing how the others were doing, but he doubted they had faced the same struggles as he had. Whoever targeted him would be willing to sacrifice Lolaline because she was already his slave, but would they sacrifice all the other sylphs as well? Silas doubted that. Shivering, Silas walked forward and cut open the bellies of the 2 apes. Struggling, he barely managed to prop them up with a combination of his feet and his telekinesis to form a barrier around him. Unfortunately, the cold hadn't disappeared, and his challenges were only just starting. Even so, there was an equally cold light in the depths of his indifferent eyes as the warm blood of the apes coated him. Chapter 399, Elemental Healing. Silas focused one of his minds on circulating ether to his arms, trying to heal them as quickly as possible. With another, he began to go through the spatial devices that he had gathered. He ignored most of the treasures, sifting through the elixirs instead. Unfortunately, he was disappointed. It wasn't that the sylphs didn't have elixirs. It was rather that, well, Frostbane Elemental Healing Elixir, FF, consumable. A sweet nectar pulled from heavenly dew. Drink this and heal yourself. For every 20 points of intelligence, boost healing capacity by plus 100%. Effects last a single day. This was clearly a healing elixir designed for races like the sylphs. They had poor physicals, but their path of the Mancer was strong. They were practically elemental creatures. The problem was that while this Frostbane Elemental Healing Elixir would be a tonic to them, to Silas, it was little more than poison. Silas had ice poison affinity as well, but his was far weaker than the Frostbane rune. While he could control stronger ice poison runes with his rune soul, his body wasn't strong enough to keep up. Namely, his ice poison affinity was still too low. Ultimately, he only had a fragmented class and had a long way to go. As Silas continued to search, he could only continuously circulate his ether to his arms and ankle, hoping for a better result. However, whether it was the healing elixirs, the ether replenishment elixirs, or even some rare explosive strength increase elixirs, they were all reliant on Frostbane. Silas grit his teeth. There was only one way, then. He shrugged the first ape off of him and gathered the one solid gain from their spatial devices, ether stones. They were abundant, and Silas was actually pretty sure that there were 2 E-grade ether stones in Vayu's ring. He didn't know what this meant, or what kind of value it had, but he was sure it was quite a lot. Well, in killing him, he He also inherited all of their F-coins, and his totals right now could only be said to be truly astronomical. Coins, 1,387,372, F. Wealthy was an understatement for these people. Even with his placement on the leaderboards, it would take Silas half a year to accumulate this amount of wealth. Well, if he ignored the increases that were coming. Silas arranged the transmutation beast skin and used an ether stone to trigger it. Failed. No. Out of energy. Silas only needed one ether stone to activate the beast skin. Last time, he had taken one from Lolaline, but it hadn't ended up needing the entire thing, so he had used it again, this time only for the process to stop halfway. Pulling out another stone, Silas triggered it again. This time, the beast skin finished its job and Silas popped the pill into his mouth. The result was completely out of his expectation. Boom, boom, boom. His blood began to boil, a large amount of nutrition rushing through him. The swelling on his arm began to go down at a visible speed, and his ankle snapped back into place all on its own. At the same time, the accumulated fatigue and wear and tear on his body began to fly away from him like steam on an engine. Silas' eyes brightened. He had still underestimated just how strong the bodies of the clandestine apes were. The abundance of energy in their bodies was so great that it was only natural they be able to heal him like this. He had thought that there would be a problem because they lacked ether, but that only weakened his ether and mental recovery. Although he was trading off a chance to replenish his mind and ether, the healing to his body made it more than easy enough for him to ignore this. The trouble was that he needed his mind to fend off this cold. If his concentration ran out, he would end up just like Lolaline. The simple solution seemed to be to absorb the second ape, the one he hadn't taken a gene out of and would still have access to its ether and mental stats. However, there was no way Silas would do that, not if it meant putting that mutated, cancerous gene into his body. He didn't want to find out what would happen if he took such a path. He might end up killing himself for all he knew. It seemed that he was just going to have to rely on less than maddened enlightenment and hope that it could carry him to the finish line. Silas took a deep breath, feeling his body crackle and pop. He looked toward the second stair again, his eyes blazing. Standing to his feet, blood that was both his own and that of the apes fell from him in waves. He used extricate on the second ape, pulling out its mutated gene before using the transmutation beast skin on it. This was going to be his path to survival. Heroina and her team appeared. Beads of sweat fell down their faces, and some sported some injuries, but she hadn't lost a single member. By comparison. Several minutes later, Breeze's team appeared. They were down to just 7 members, and their giantess of a team leader couldn't help but look at Heroina with a scalding gaze. After failing to catch up to Vayu the first time, the cooperation between these two had obviously fallen apart. And it was likewise obvious which of the two had taken the upper hand. Looking around, Breeze also realized that Heroina had gotten here first. That meant that she would get to choose which door to enter after the team battle first, leaving the rest of them on tenterhooks. But at this point, Breeze just wanted her to pick anyone but her. The minutes continued to tick by and the two were surprised by the time they had. Realizing that this was a rare opportunity and that they wouldn't be jumping into battle instantly, they immediately commanded their team to start focusing on healing themselves. By the time Silas finally appeared, most had recovered to more than 80%. As for Silas, beaten and haggard, covered in blood from head to toe, he trudged forward. The only points of light on his entire body were his glowing pair of green irises. Chapter 400, Icy Cave. The two women and their teams only got the chance to catch a glimpse of Silas before their expressions changed completely. This wasn't because of Silas' appearance himself, but rather the fact that they could already feel the teleportation kick in. This only meant one thing. Vayu's team was dead. And the most likely culprit was Silas himself. Although there was a chance that Vayu and his people had died during the stair challenge. Looking at Silas right now, none of them would dare to guarantee such a thing. Silas vanished, and when he reappeared, he was in a land of ice and snow. However, there was no opponent across from him. The system detected this as well and Silas was transported once again. His victory had been claimed and he earned a full 1,000 points. When Silas' vision cleared once more, he was standing before 4 doors. Unfortunately, he didn't get the chance to choose this time. He was last to appear, so between himself and the other two teams, Aeroiner would get to choose first, then Brisa, and only then would it be himself. If he was lucky, in the time Aeroiner and Brisa spent fighting against one another in the team battle, he would get to recover. However, if he was unlucky, a mere single minute later, Aeroiner and Brisa's teams appeared, their conflict having already been settled. Silas didn't react to this. He already expected as much. If the two teams were equal, he could have hoped for a long, drawn-out battle. But, Aeroiner had clearly already asserted her dominance, so that made it easy for Brisa to give concessions. The two were now vying for first and second place, and from their perspective, they couldn't allow Silas to have any time to rest. He was clearly a danger if he could crush Vyu's team, so they had to treat him as such. Looking down on him would only get them killed. The worse his condition, the better it would be for them. Seeing Silas still covered in blood and wheezing for breath, they knew they had made the right decision. Especially when they felt the sharpness of his gaze. It felt to them that they were like a twin pair of green blades continuously piercing into their skin. The two teams didn't say a word, and as expected, Aeroiner moved forward to pick her door first. What was a slight surprise was that she didn't pick Ivy like one would have expected. It was the obvious choice, the door that had no opponent and would thus grant an easy win and a full slate of points in the upcoming team battle. Instead, she chose 3, Silas' door. Once his door was chosen, Silas obviously didn't get a choice himself and he was immediately transported out. But, not before he gave Aeroiner a glance. He could see through her thoughts. The more she dragged it out, the greater chance Silas would have of reversing the situation. So, why not crush him as quickly as she could? It was no wonder she got Brisa to agree so readily. She had essentially handed Brisa a free chance to catch up in points despite having far fewer people. And, should things go optimally, Aeroiner would end up losing at least a few people at Silas' hand as well. Aeroiner only had one goal. First place. And Silas was standing in the way of that. ... Silas appeared in a land of ice. There was a crystal clear sheen as far as the eye could see, and for the first time, there were no stairs. Instead, there was a cave entrance at the foot of a mountain. The second will challenge. The first thing Silas noticed, though, wasn't all of this at all. It was the biting, frigid cold that seeped into his very bones. As expected, he wasn't so lucky. His entire dungeon had been tampered with, and judging by the fact the other two teams had escaped unscathed, clearly theirs was not. If he wanted to make it to the end, he would have to deal with this supped-up dungeon all the way through. His jaw set and his gaze became colder. Silas couldn't remember the last time he was angry. Or maybe it was that those memories had been mostly ignored or repressed by him. Even when people did wrong by him, he didn't react much, because he knew that in the end, he would come out on top. Olivia was one example of this. The Grimblades were another, though a far more serious example. Even when they indirectly threatened his family, his reaction was almost indifferent. It was a stoicism he prided himself on. He didn't believe that a disciplined person should mouth off or lose their temper at the drop of a hat, something that probably made his affection for Kasari all the more amusing or ironic. In a lot of ways, she was everything that he was not. Or maybe, she represented a part of him that he didn't allow free. Staring at this mountain, and feeling his limbs and sinew being eaten into by this flesh-rending cold, there was a small flame of anger hiding in the depths of his heart, and it was slowly growing. Silas didn't put his anger into words because he knew if he thought about it his control just might spiral. At that point, he really wasn't sure what he would do. Instead, he put one foot forward after the next, feeling his mind wearing down as he battled against the cold with his rune soul, flicking away the dense runes of ice poison in a vain attempt to keep himself warm. Then, he entered the cave. It was well lit and just as crystalline as everything else. Ahead were the stairs he thought would be missing this time around, but he simply couldn't see to the end of them. There was just a long tunnel up to the top of the mountain. And he would have to walk it alone.